My name is Clara, and I just turned 18. Most people think this is the age when life begins, freedom, independence, the start of adulthood. But for me, it feels like a prison, a never-ending cycle of fear, shame, and disbelief. My family should have been my safe haven, but now it's the place I feel most trapped. My sister, Julia, is 28. She's always been my hero, my guide, my confidant. Growing up, she was the one who taught me how to braid my hair, how to navigate mean girls at school, and how to chase my dreams. So when she married Ethan last year, I was thrilled for her. He seemed perfect, successful, kind, funny, and he treated Julia like a queen. At least, that's what I thought. Ethan is 10 years older than me, and I never saw him as anything more than my brother-in-law. When he joined the family, he was warm and welcoming, always joking around with me and making me feel included. I thought he was just being nice. I didn't see the subtle ways his kindness began to shift, the way his compliments turned more personal, the way he always found excuses to be alone with me. It started last summer when I was helping Julia and Ethan move into their new house. Julia was at work that day, and Ethan asked if I could come over to help unpack boxes. I didn't think twice about it. He was family, after all. At first, it was normal, sorting books, folding clothes, organizing the kitchen. But then Ethan started making comments that made me uncomfortable. "You've really grown up, Clara," he said, his eyes scanning me in a way that made my skin crawl. "You're not a little girl anymore." I laughed nervously, brushing it off. But as the day went on, his behavior became more invasive. He stood too close, his hand lingering on my back when he passed by, his compliments becoming more suggestive. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking. Then came the day that changed everything. Julia was out of town for a work conference, and Ethan asked if I could come by to help with some gardening. I hesitated but didn't want to seem rude. I told myself it was fine, that I was being paranoid. But as soon as I arrived, I knew something was wrong. Ethan was too relaxed, too casual. He handed me a glass of wine, insisting it was just a small way to say thank you. I shouldn't have taken it. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't want to make a scene. I drank it quickly, trying to get it over with, but before I knew it, he poured another. I felt my head get fuzzy, my body sluggish. That's when he made his move. "You're special, Clara," he said, his voice low and coaxing. "You're so much more mature than other girls your age. You're beautiful, you know that?" I tried to laugh it off, to change the subject, but he didn't stop. He moved closer, his hands on my shoulders, and I froze. "Ethan, this isn't right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he didn't listen. That night is a blur of fear and pain, of whispered apologies and excuses I didn't want to hear. I told him to stop, over and over, but it didn't matter. When it was over, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried until there were no tears left. The worst part wasn't even the act itself, it was the aftermath. I told Julia what happened. I begged her to believe me, to see the truth of what Ethan had done. But she didn't. Her face twisted with disbelief, then anger. "Why would you make something like this up, Clara?" she demanded. "Ethan loves me. He would never do something like that." And just like that, my world fell apart. No one believed me. Not Julia, not my parents, not even my closest friends. I was the liar, the jealous little sister trying to ruin a perfect marriage. Now, I'm alone in this nightmare, carrying a burden I never asked for. I don't know how to make them see the truth, or if I even can. All I know is that I can't keep silent forever. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't look at Ethan without feeling sick, and I couldn't look at Julia without feeling the crushing weight of her disbelief. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt cold and suffocating. Every family dinner, every casual gathering, was a silent battlefield. Ethan, of course, acted like nothing had happened. He smiled, he joked, he played the role of the perfect husband and son-in-law. Sometimes, he'd catch my eye across the table and smirk, like he was daring me to say something. Other times, he'd act overly polite toward me, knowing it only made me feel worse. It was like he knew I was powerless to do anything about it. I tried talking to my parents again, hoping they'd see how serious I was. I told them everything, how Ethan had started with small gestures, how he manipulated me, how I had begged him to stop. But they just shook their heads, their expressions a mix of frustration and disappointment. "Clara, you have to understand what you're saying," my dad said sternly. "This is a serious accusation. You can't just ruin someone's life because of a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? How could they think that? I wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them see the truth. But every word I spoke seemed to dig me deeper into a hole of doubt and mistrust. My mom's voice was softer, but her words cut just as deep. "Sweetheart, are you sure you're not misinterpreting things? Ethan's always been so kind to you. Maybe he was just being friendly." Friendly. That's what they called it. I wanted to tell them that friendliness doesn't look like whispered threats and stolen moments of control. But the words caught in my throat. They didn't believe me, and nothing I said would change that. Julia didn't help, either. She barely spoke to me after I told her. When she did, it was cold and distant, like I was a stranger invading her home. One day, she finally snapped. "You've always been jealous of me, haven't you?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You can't stand that I have a husband who loves me, so you're trying to destroy it. Well, it's not going to work, Clara. I'm not going to let you ruin my life." Her words hit me like a slap. Julia, the sister I had idolized for years, thought I was jealous of her. She thought I wanted what she had, when all I wanted was for her to believe me, to protect me. But instead, she protected him. At school, I tried to act normal, but it was impossible. I felt like a ghost of myself, walking through hallways filled with noise and chatter, yet completely disconnected from it all. My best friend, Ava, noticed something was wrong and kept asking me about it. I wanted to tell her, but I was terrified. If my own family didn't believe me, how could I expect her to? The few times I tried to open up, the words wouldn't come. Instead, I'd change the subject or laugh it off, pretending everything was fine. But Ava wasn't convinced. One day, she cornered me in the library, her eyes filled with concern. "Clara, I know something's going on," she said. "You've been different lately. Distant. Please, just tell me. Whatever it is, I'm here for you." Her kindness made me want to cry. But I couldn't risk it. I couldn't risk losing her, too. So I lied. I told her I was just stressed about school, about college applications, about anything that wasn't the truth. She nodded, though I could tell she didn't believe me. "Okay," she said quietly. "But if you ever need to talk, I'm here." I thanked her, but inside, I felt even more alone. I wanted so desperately to tell someone, anyone, what was happening to me. But the fear of not being believed was paralyzing. Every night, I lay in bed replaying the events over and over, wondering if I could have done something differently, wondering if this was somehow my fault. Maybe if I hadn't gone to his house that day. Maybe if I had screamed louder. Maybe if I hadn't been so trusting. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't my fault. It was Ethan's. And no matter how hard he tried to make me feel powerless, I wasn't going to let him win. I just didn't know how to fight back yet. The weeks after everything happened were a blur. I tried to push it all down, to lock it away in some hidden part of my mind. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, my body wouldn't let me. I started feeling strange, tired all the time, nauseous at the worst moments, and dizzy in ways I couldn't explain. At first, I chalked it up to stress. After all, I hadn't slept properly in weeks, and my appetite was practically non-existent. It had to be stress. But then, my period was late. It wasn't unusual for me to be a day or two off, but this felt different. A week passed, then two, and the sick feeling in my stomach only got worse. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, but the thought kept creeping into my mind, growing louder and more persistent until I couldn't ignore it anymore. What if I was pregnant? The thought made me feel like I was suffocating. I kept telling myself it wasn't possible, that this was just my anxiety running wild. But the nagging doubt wouldn't leave me alone. One afternoon, after school, I finally worked up the courage to do something about it. I walked to the drugstore on the edge of town, my heart pounding with every step. The aisle seemed endless, stretching on forever as I searched for the pregnancy tests. When I finally found them, I froze. There were so many brands, so many options, and I had no idea which one to choose. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the first box I saw and headed to the checkout. The cashier didn't even look at me, but I felt like everyone in the store was staring, judging, knowing. I shoved the box into my bag and walked out as quickly as I could. Back home, I locked myself in the bathroom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the packaging. The instructions were simple enough, but I read them over and over, trying to delay the inevitable. Finally, I couldn't put it off any longer. I took the test, set it on the counter, and sat on the floor, staring at the tiles as the seconds crawled by. When I finally looked at the test, my stomach dropped. 2 lines. Positive. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I clutched the test in my hands, as if holding it tighter would change the result. But it didn't. I was pregnant. And there was no question about who the father was. I sat on the bathroom floor for what felt like hours, my mind spinning in every direction. How could this happen? How could I let this happen? What was I supposed to do now? I thought about my parents, about Julia, about Ethan. The thought of telling anyone made me want to disappear. But I couldn't avoid it forever. This wasn't something I could ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I needed help. I needed someone to tell me what to do, someone to make this nightmare go away. But who could I turn to when everyone I trusted had already let me down? Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to leave the bathroom. I hid the test at the bottom of the trash can, buried under layers of tissues and wrappers, as if that would somehow keep my secret safe. Then I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets over my head like a shield. I knew I couldn't keep this hidden forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. But for now, I just wanted to disappear, to let the darkness swallow me whole. The days after I found out I was pregnant were some of the longest of my life. Every morning, I woke up hoping it had all been a bad dream, that I could go back to being just a regular 18-year-old girl worrying about tests and college applications. But the nausea, the dizziness, and the ache in my chest were constant reminders that this was real, and there was no waking up from it. At school, I felt like I was moving through a fog. Everything seemed distant, like I was watching my life from the outside. Ava kept asking if I was okay, and I kept brushing her off with excuses about being tired or stressed. I hated lying to her, but what could I say? How could I explain something I barely understood myself? At home, it was worse. I avoided everyone, my parents, Julia, even Ethan. Especially Ethan. Every time I saw him, I felt like I was going to throw up. I couldn't stop replaying that night in my head, his words, his hands, the way he had taken something from me that I could never get back. And now, the proof of it was growing inside me, a constant reminder of what he had done. But I couldn't stay invisible forever. One evening, during dinner, my mom looked up from her plate and frowned. "Clara, are you feeling okay? You've barely touched your food lately." I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just not hungry." Julia glanced at me, her expression skeptical. "You've been acting weird for weeks. Is something going on?" "No," I said too quickly, my voice sharp. "I'm fine. Can we not do this right now?" She raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. I could feel Ethan's eyes on me from across the table, and it took everything in me not to scream. I kept my head down for the rest of the meal, counting the seconds until I could escape to my room. Once I was alone, the tears came. They seemed to come all the time now, spilling over without warning. I felt like I was drowning, and no matter how hard I tried to keep my head above water, the waves kept pulling me under. I knew I needed to tell someone, but every time I thought about it, the words got stuck in my throat. My parents didn't believe me when I told them what Ethan had done. Why would they believe me now? Julia had already called me a liar, a jealous little sister trying to ruin her marriage. And Ethan. Ethan would twist this, like he twisted everything. He'd make it seem like I was the one in the wrong, like I had done something to deserve this. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about the future. About what this would mean for me, for my family, for the life growing inside me. The fear was overwhelming, but beneath it, there was something else, a spark of determination. Ethan had already taken so much from me. I couldn't let him take my future too. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. But one thing was clear, I couldn't keep this secret forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. And when it did, I needed to be ready to fight for myself, no matter what it cost me. The secret weighed heavier on me with each passing day. I started avoiding school and staying in my room as much as possible. My parents were growing suspicious, especially my mom, who had begun asking more questions. "Clara, are you sure you're okay? You look pale. You've lost weight. Maybe you should see a doctor." I always came up with an excuse: stress from school, a stomach bug, anything to get her off my back. But I knew I couldn't keep lying forever. I needed to tell someone. I needed help. One evening, after dinner, I mustered the courage to talk to Ava. She was the only person who had ever truly been there for me, the only one who might believe me. I texted her, "Can we talk? It's serious." She replied immediately, "Of course. My place or yours?" We decided to meet at the park, where it was quiet and private. As I walked there, my hands shook, and my stomach churned, not from nausea this time, but from fear. What if she didn't believe me? What if this ruined our friendship? Ava was already waiting on one of the benches when I arrived. Her face lit up when she saw me, but her smile quickly faded. "Clara, what's going on? You look scared." I sat down next to her, my hands clutching my knees. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words felt like they were lodged in my throat, refusing to come out. But then I thought about the test, about the 2 lines staring back at me, and the dam broke. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ava's eyes widened in shock. "What? How? Clara, who?" I took a deep breath, the tears already streaming down my face. "It's Ethan," I said, choking on his name. "Julia's husband. He did something to me." I told him to stop, but he didn't listen. And now I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ava stared at me, her expression a mix of disbelief and horror. "Clara," she said slowly, "are you sure?" I nodded, wiping my face with my sleeve. "I didn't want this, Ava. I swear." I told him no. But no one believes me, not Julia, not my parents. They think I'm lying. Ava reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "I believe you," she said quietly. "I believe you, Clara." Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness. For the first time since it happened, someone believed me. Someone was on my side. "What are you going to do?" she asked gently. "I don't know," I admitted. "I can't keep this a secret forever. But if I tell my parents, they'll just think I'm trying to ruin Julia's marriage again. And if I tell Julia, I don't even want to think about that." Ava was silent for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "You need proof," she said finally. "Something they can't ignore or deny. And you need help from someone who can actually do something, an adult who isn't your parents." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what that meant or how I was supposed to get proof. But Ava's belief in me gave me a sliver of hope, a tiny light in the darkness. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I'm here for you. You're not alone in this, Clara." Her words gave me strength, but they also reminded me of the impossible road ahead. Telling Ava was one thing, but facing my family, facing Ethan? That was a battle I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I didn't have a choice. The truth was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. Ava's belief in me gave me a small spark of courage, but her suggestion that I needed proof left me feeling helpless. How was I supposed to prove what Ethan had done? He was careful, calculated. There were no texts, no messages, nothing I could show anyone. And the pregnancy? It felt like more of a weapon he could use against me than a piece of evidence that would make people believe me. Still, I couldn't stay silent forever. The longer I waited, the harder it became to hide the truth. The nausea was getting worse, and my mom had started noticing how often I ran to the bathroom. "Clara, are you sure it's just stress?" she asked one morning. "Maybe we should schedule a doctor's appointment." "No, Mom, really, I'm fine," I insisted. "It's nothing. I'll be okay." She didn't look convinced, but she let it go for the moment. I knew my time was running out. If I didn't take control of this, someone else would, and I couldn't let Ethan control the narrative. That weekend, while my parents were out and Julia was at work, I saw my chance. Ethan was in the living room, watching TV. I grabbed my phone and took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. I needed him to admit something, anything, that I could record. I walked into the living room and sat down on the edge of the couch, keeping my distance. He glanced at me, his smirk making my stomach churn. "What's up, Clara?" he asked, his voice dripping with false charm. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. I hit record on my phone, which was hidden in my pocket. "About what?" he asked, leaning back with an air of amusement. "About what happened," I said carefully. "You know what you did." "I told you no, Ethan. Why didn't you stop?" He didn't respond right away, but his smile faltered for a brief moment. Then he laughed, a low, mocking sound. "Clara, you're being dramatic," he said. "We were just having a little fun. You're the one who came over that day, remember?" My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I didn't want it, Ethan," I said, my voice stronger now. "I told you to stop." He rolled his eyes, his tone turning condescending. "You didn't exactly fight me off, did you? And who's going to believe you, anyway? Your sister? Your parents? They already think you're lying." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I stood up, my heart pounding. "I just wanted you to admit it," I said quietly. "That's all I needed." I walked out of the room, ignoring his confused expression. Once I was in my room, I pulled out my phone and listened to the recording. My hands were shaking as I replayed his words. "You didn't exactly fight me off, did you? And who's going to believe you, anyway?" It wasn't perfect, but it was something. It was proof that he didn't deny what he had done, proof that he was trying to twist the truth in his favor. I sent the recording to Ava, my only ally, and her reply came almost immediately. "This is it. This is your proof. We're going to make them believe you, Clara. I promise." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't sure how this would end, but I knew one thing: I wasn't alone anymore. And I wasn't going to let Ethan win. With the recording saved on my phone, I finally felt like I had a weapon to fight back. But the thought of actually using it made my stomach churn. What would happen when I played it for my family? Would they believe me this time, or would they find some way to excuse Ethan again? The doubt gnawed at me, but I couldn't let it stop me. I had come too far to back down now. Ava encouraged me every step of the way. "You've got this, Clara," she said over the phone. "You've already done the hard part. Now it's time to make them see the truth. We decided that I would confront my parents first. I needed them on my side before going to Julia. She was still so blinded by her love for Ethan that I knew she wouldn't listen to me unless my parents believed me too. That evening, after dinner, I asked my parents if we could talk. "It's important," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My dad raised an eyebrow. "What's this about, Clara?" "You'll understand when I tell you," I said. "Can we sit down in the living room?" They exchanged a glance but followed me. My mom looked concerned, while my dad seemed more irritated than anything. I took a deep breath as we sat down, my heart racing. "It's about Ethan," I began, gripping my phone tightly in my hand. "I told you before that he did something to me, and you didn't believe me. But I have proof now." My mom's face tightened, and my dad crossed his arms. "Clara, we've been over this," he said. "You can't keep making these accusations." "Just listen," I interrupted, my voice rising. "Please, just listen to what I have to say." I pulled out my phone and played the recording. The room was silent except for Ethan's voice echoing from the speaker. "You didn't exactly fight me off, did you? And who's going to believe you, anyway?" When it ended, I looked up at my parents, my hands trembling. My mom's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock. My dad's expression was harder to read, but I could see the doubt starting to crack. "Do you believe me now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He admitted it. "He hurt me, and he thinks no one will believe me." My mom covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Clara. I didn't know. I didn't." "I told you," I said, my voice breaking. "I told you, and you didn't believe me. You let him stay in this house, and now I'm pregnant because of him." The words hung in the air like a bomb. My mom gasped, and my dad's face hardened. "You're pregnant?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't want this. I didn't ask for any of this. But it happened, and I need your help." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then my mom reached out and pulled me into a hug, her tears soaking into my shirt. "I'm so sorry, Clara," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." My dad's expression softened, but his hands were clenched into fists. "We're going to handle this," he said, his voice steady but full of anger. "He's not getting away with this." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. My parents believed me now, and they were ready to stand by my side. But there was still one more person I needed to face, Julia. And I knew that would be the hardest confrontation of all. The next morning, my parents decided it was time to tell Julia. They were furious, my dad especially, and wanted to confront Ethan right away. But I convinced them to talk to Julia first. She deserved to hear the truth from us, not in the middle of a screaming match, but in a way that might make her understand. Julia came over that afternoon, oblivious to the storm waiting for her. She greeted my mom with a hug, and when she saw me sitting on the couch, she hesitated. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing the tension in the room. My dad gestured to the chair across from us. "Sit down, Julia," he said, his voice firm. "We need to talk." She frowned but sat down, her eyes flickering between the three of us. "This sounds serious. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, my palms sweaty against the phone in my hands. "It's about Ethan," I said quietly. Her expression immediately hardened. "Not this again," she said, rolling her eyes. "Clara, I thought we were done with this." "We're not done," my dad said sharply. "Listen to what she has to say." Julia crossed her arms, glaring at me. "Fine. What is it now?" I played the recording. Ethan's voice filled the room, his mocking tone cutting through the air like a knife. "You didn't exactly fight me off, did you? And who's going to believe you, anyway?" When the recording ended, Julia's face was pale, her mouth slightly open. For a moment, I thought she believed me. But then she shook her head, her lips curling into a bitter smile. This could be fake, she said, her voice trembling. Anyone can edit a recording. You can't expect me to believe this. My mom spoke up, her voice soft but firm. Julia, she's telling the truth. We believe her. Julia's eyes darted to my mom, then to my dad, whose jaw was tight with anger. You believe this? She asked, her voice rising. You're going to take her side over your own son-in-law? Over my husband? Julia, I said, my voice shaking, he hurt me. He's the reason I'm pregnant. Her face crumpled at that, tears spilling down her cheeks. Pregnant, she whispered. No, this can't be true. Ethan would never, he loves me, Clara. He wouldn't do this to me. He did, I said, my voice breaking. He did it to me, and now you're trying to protect him. Please, Julia, just listen to me. Look at me. She shook her head, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. My dad leaned forward, his voice low and steady. Julia, I know this is hard to hear, but Ethan isn't who you think he is. He's been lying to you, and he's hurt your sister in a way that's unforgivable. We can't ignore this. Julia's sobs quieted, and she looked at me through tear-filled eyes. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice barely audible. I did, I said. I told you, and you didn't believe me. I didn't have proof then, but I do now. Please, Julia, believe me. I'm not lying. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of her shaky breaths. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I need to talk to him, she said, her voice hollow. I need to hear what he has to say. My dad stood up, his expression fierce. We'll all talk to him, he said. Together. He doesn't get to twist this. Julia didn't respond, her face blank as she stared at the floor. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it wasn't her fault, but I didn't know how. The truth was out now, but it felt like the hardest part was still ahead. The tension in the house was unbearable as we waited for Ethan to arrive. My dad called him and told him to come over immediately, refusing to explain why. Ethan sounded confused but agreed, unaware of the storm he was walking into. I sat on the couch, clutching Ava's hand for support. She had insisted on being there, and I was grateful for her presence. Julia sat silently in the armchair, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling in her lap. When Ethan walked in, his usual confident smile vanished the moment he saw all of us waiting. What's going on? He asked, his voice cautious. His eyes darted to Julia, then to me, and I saw a flicker of fear behind his mask of confusion. My dad didn't waste time. We know, Ethan, he said, his tone icy. Clara told us everything, and we've heard the recording. Ethan froze, his face going pale. Recording, he repeated, his voice faltering. I stood up, my heart pounding. I recorded you, Ethan, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I have proof of what you did to me. You can't deny it anymore. His eyes flickered between me and Julia, who was staring at him with a mix of shock and betrayal. I don't know what she's talking about, he said quickly, his voice rising. This is insane. Clara's been making up lies about me for weeks. Stop lying. Julia screamed, standing up abruptly. I heard it, Ethan. Your voice. Your words. You said no one would believe her. How could you do this to her? To me? I didn't do anything. Ethan shouted back, his facade cracking. She's twisting everything. Clara, tell them the truth. The truth? I snapped, my voice breaking. You want the truth? You hurt me, Ethan. You took advantage of me, and now I'm pregnant because of you. That's the truth. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. Ethan's face contorted with anger and desperation. She's lying, he said, his voice trembling. She's just trying to ruin our marriage, Julia. You can't believe her. I do believe her, Julia said, tears streaming down her face. I can't ignore this, Ethan. I can't ignore what you've done. My dad stepped forward, his face red with fury. You're done, Ethan, he said. You're not welcome in this house anymore. We're calling the police. Ethan's eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw real fear on his face. You can't do that, he said, his voice cracking. This is a misunderstanding. It's not a misunderstanding, my mom shouted, her voice shaking with anger. You hurt our daughter, and you will pay for it. Ethan looked around the room, realizing he had no allies left. He turned to Julia, his expression pleading. Please, Julia, don't do this. I love you. We can work through this. Julia shook her head, her voice hollow. You don't love me, she said. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. Get out. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The room was silent except for the sound of Julia's quiet sobs. My mom came over and pulled me into a hug, her tears mixing with mine. We'll handle this, Clara, my dad said, his voice steady. You don't have to go through this alone anymore. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and Ethan was gone. It wasn't over yet, but I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. The hours after Ethan stormed out felt like a blur. My parents were on the phone with the police, reporting everything that had happened. My mom stayed by my side the whole time, her hand resting gently on my shoulder, while Julia sat silently in the corner, her face pale and her eyes distant. When the police arrived, I told them everything, what Ethan had done, how he manipulated me, how I had recorded him. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but with Ava sitting beside me, I found the strength to push through. The officers listened carefully, their expressions a mix of sympathy and professionalism. They took my recording as evidence and assured us they would launch an investigation. After they left, the house fell quiet again. My dad was pacing in the kitchen, his anger barely contained. My mom sat beside me, holding my hand, while Julia stared at the floor, tears silently streaming down her face. Julia, I said softly, breaking the silence. I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. She looked up at me, her face filled with pain and regret. I'm the one who should be sorry, she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't believe you when you tried to tell me. I should have protected you, Clara. I failed you. We both started crying, and for the first time in months, it felt like we were sisters again. She hugged me tightly, whispering apologies over and over, and I clung to her, finally letting some of the pain and fear melt away. In the days that followed, everything began to change. The police issued a warrant for Ethan's arrest, and he was taken into custody a week later. The news spread quickly among our family and friends, and while there were whispers and speculation, most people supported me. Ava stayed by my side through it all, a constant source of strength and reassurance. Julia moved back home temporarily, trying to piece her life back together. It wasn't easy. Everywhere she turned, there were reminders of Ethan and the life she thought they were building together. But she was determined to move forward, and so was I. The hardest part was dealing with the pregnancy. I still didn't know what I wanted to do, but for the first time, I felt like I had options. My parents promised to support me no matter what decision I made, and Julia assured me that she would be there every step of the way. One evening, a few weeks after Ethan's arrest, my mom sat down with me in my room. Clara, she said gently, I know this has been the hardest thing you've ever faced. But I want you to know how proud I am of you, for speaking up, for fighting back, for being so strong. Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I hugged her tightly. I couldn't have done it without you, I said. Without all of you. The road ahead wasn't easy. There were court dates, therapy sessions, and countless moments of doubt and fear. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone. My family, broken and flawed as it was, had come together to help me heal. And slowly, day by day, I started to believe that I could move forward. That I could reclaim my life from the pain Ethan had caused. That I could be more than a victim, I could be a survivor. It was just the beginning of my journey, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough.